So Canada just finished something massive, and most people have no idea that it happened 10 days ago, while the tariff headlines were eating every front page. Ottawa signed a free trade deal with Ecuador. Now that sounds like a routine announcement, right? But it's anything but. Because with Ecuador locked in, Canada now has free trade agreements with every single country on South America's Pacific coast. That's Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. Every single one. The Pacific Wall is complete, and Washington helped build it by being so unpredictable that Canada had every reason to construct an exit. For the last 18 months, Trump was threatening tariffs, and Poilievre was making noise from the sidelines. Carney's team was doing something far more consequential in the background. They were building the infrastructure to make the U.S. market optional. Not tomorrow, not next year, but on a trajectory that is now locked in by signed agreements and trade relationships that don't get unsigned when the American political winds shift. The wall is up, the door is open, and Washington missed it completely.
Right. When Carney's government took office, they set a specific, concrete target: double Canada's non-US trade by 2035. And the way you get to double it is not by hoping that Washington gets its act together. It's by signing deals, building corridors, and reducing the cost of alternatives until the math permanently changes in Canada's favor. And this is where the Ecuador deal sits inside of a much larger picture. Prime Minister Carney's government has been actively signing trade agreements around the world. The EU relationship is deepening, the UK deal is active, the Indo-Pacific strategy is producing signed agreements. The Pacific Alliance corridor, Chile, Peru, and Colombia, was already in place. So each deal made the American market less indispensable. Each corridor made the dependency math slightly less lopsided. And Ecuador was the final piece of that specific wall. On July 24th, that wall was sealed. Ecuador's minister flew all the way from South America to Ottawa just for this, at a moment when every country is watching North American trade wars and deciding which side of this equation to build toward. Well, Ecuador just picked the side with a growing list of trade agreements and a completed Pacific corridor. That tells you everything about where the world thinks this is going. It's Canada for the win.
So what makes this specific wall so important anyway? Well, once the agreement is ratified, 99.6% of Ecuador's goods will enter Canada completely tariff-free. Ecuador removes duties on 97.2% of all Canadian goods, covering the entire product range. More than 600 specific product categories gain zero duty access. We're talking bananas, cocoa, shrimp, tropical fruits, fresh-cut flowers, precious metals, and petroleum oils. This means a lot for Canadian consumers, as well as Canadian food security. Canada currently imports cocoa, bananas, shrimp, and other tropical products largely through American intermediaries, or tariff-subject channels. Now, once the Ecuador Free Trade Agreement is in force, it creates a direct, duty-free food corridor to one of the most productive agricultural countries in South America, bypassing American supply chains entirely. So, the next time Trump decides to flip the switch on tariffs or restrict Canadian access to some supply chains, Canada now has a direct Pacific route to Ecuadorian agriculture that operates completely outside of any of his leverage.
And what most people miss is that Ecuador is a gateway, not just a supplier. It sits on the Pacific Rim with direct access to shipping lanes that run west to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Indo-Pacific. When you overlay Ecuador on the existing Chilean, Peruvian, and Colombian agreements, you're not looking at 4 separate bilateral relationships. You're looking at one continuous, unbroken maritime corridor running all the way down the Pacific coast of South America. Every major port along that coastline is now part of Canada's preferential trade network. That's a geographic position that took years to build, and it will stay in place, no matter what Trump says. Canada was already doing a massive amount of trade with Ecuador before the Free Trade Agreement made it official. Two-way merchandise trade between Canada and Ecuador reached $2 billion Canadian dollars in 2025, up 2.9% year over year.
Ecuador is Canada's 6th largest merchandise trading partner in South America, and that ranking is expected to rise as preferential access takes effect and Canadian exporters begin routing more business through the new corridor. And what that means for Canadian trade in practical terms is that goods could now move through Vancouver and Prince Rupert, two of the most capable port complexes on the Pacific Rim, into a preferential corridor that covers the entire Pacific coast of South America and connects through Pacific shipping lanes directly to Asia. Canada's exposure to the American market hasn't disappeared, and it won't disappear next year. But it is demonstrably, contractually, much smaller than it was on the day that Carney took office. And it gets smaller with every agreement that gets ratified. Trump's protection strategy only works when there's no alternative. Canada has spent the last 2 years creating those alternatives. Instead of relying on one dominant market, it's building a wider network of trading partners that gives Canadian businesses more options if trade tensions continue. Speaking of those tensions, let's take a look at what's happening south of the border, because you can't fully understand what Canada just built without seeing what's happening in the United States. American farmers are facing significant accumulated losses across the sector after several years of trade disputes. On the trade side, America's agricultural trade deficit, what the U.S. imports versus what it exports, is expected to reach around $41.5 billion this year. Think about that for a second. The country that helped shape the modern global trading system is now running a massive agricultural trade deficit. China's retaliatory tariffs have also taken a heavy toll on American agriculture. Billions of dollars in exports that once flowed into the Chinese market have been lost. Soybeans, corn, wheat. Many of those products are now being redirected to secondary buyers at lower margins, while competitors continue expanding their position in China. And that pressure has forced Washington to step in with emergency financial support for American farmers affected by the trade conflict.
So let's put the two pictures side by side. On one side, Canada, a completed Pacific wall, an expanding network of trade agreements, a long-term goal of doubling non-U.S. trade by 2035, and agricultural supply chains diversified across 4 Pacific Corridor countries. On the other side, the United States. Tens of billions of dollars in agricultural losses, a projected $41.5 billion agricultural trade deficit, emergency government support for farmers, and still no new trade agreement with Canada. That contrast isn't a coincidence. It's the result of two governments choosing very different strategies to respond to the same trade pressure. Washington expected economic pressure to force Ottawa's hand. Instead, Canada spent 2 years building alternatives, one agreement at a time. Every assumption behind Washington's strategy was supposed to increase its leverage. Instead, Canada gradually expanded its options. The Canada-Ecuador Free Trade Agreement is the latest piece of that strategy. Not because Ecuador alone changes everything, but because it completes a larger network that has been under construction for years. And that's what makes this agreement so important. It wasn't built through one dramatic confrontation. It was built quietly. One negotiation, one agreement, one new trading partner at a time. Then, almost overnight, the picture looked very different. So here's my question for you. As Canada's trade network continues to expand and the United States faces growing pressure at home, do you think Washington eventually returns to the table with a serious trade deal? Or do you think this economic standoff is only going to continue? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's interested in North American politics and global trade. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.